if you grow up with a diverse language experience, such as if you speak a language in your homes, but you learn another language at school, that changes the trajectory of language and cognition in your development. Now, that is a very important key factor in how we see the diversity in classrooms. Let alone that we have people who go to school in speaking a language, but also learn another language. So there are different contexts of bilingualism happening in the classrooms here. So in today's talk, I decided to talk a little bit about my work, but not in a traditional way where I put a lot of data and numbers and graphs on the screen, but more like a storytelling, explaining to you why I'm doing the work that I'm currently doing. So I started off with thinking about a title. And the title that I decided to choose is Mending the Tower of Babel through the Science of Bilingualism. And so who recognized this picture? Good. Now, this is a picture of the Tower of Babel, and the story goes like humans on Earth during the Babylonian time wanted to build a tower that reached up to the sky to reach God. Okay, and so what you see in this picture, the people are trying to build this tower, and you see far in the corner, that's Nimrod, the king, who's trying to coordinate the effort of everyone to build this tower. And if you were God, you wouldn't be very happy that people are trying to build something to get up to your territory. So what God does is to decide to make this plan not work. So he's not very angry, and he decided to make everyone speak a different language. And without a common language, people cannot work with each other. So the lack of communication is supposedly one of the driving force of the fall of the Tower of Babel. And I learned about this story when I was a young child, and I started to think, is there a solution to this problem? To me, the world is full with problems and solutions, and I always try to find a solution. So let's think about what would be a possible solution. Now, you have a group of people all speaking different languages now, but what if, of all these individual differences in the language that they speak, they also speak one common language? So then people can communicate, and these people would also be bilingual. And that's only partly of the reason why it triggers my interest in studying bilingualism. And now I'll tell you a little bit about how I was trained and what makes me study bilingualism from many different disciplines. So I was trained as a research psychologist, and I studied child development and cognitive development. And then I got really interested in the control center of human behavior, which is the brain. And I did my postdoctoral fellowship at a hospital to get some neuroscience training. And then I thought, okay, studying bilingualism is a very interesting career path. And I have already dipped my hand in 2 fields. And now I really want to do something that makes a difference. So I started to looking for jobs in professional schools, and such as in education. And now I ended up in education working with parents, practitioners to think about how we can merge what we know about bilingualism from research into the practice of education. So in today's talk, I will cover 3 very broad strokes. The first is the bilingual mind, and you can also add the bracket and the brain. And then I will ask this question, who are bilingual? And I will end the talk by telling you a little bit about why is bilingualism relevant to education? Why is the research of bilingualism relevant to education? So first, let's take a look at the bilingual mind. So what do we mean by the bilingual mind? So one thing I've been very interested in, once we have an ability to acquire language, and because of different life experiences, learning opportunity that allow us to build up another language network, what we ended up with is a mind with 2 language systems. Now, learning 1 language well is not easy, and learning 2, it's even more challenging. And when you have 2 languages in your mind, the funny thing happens is if it happens the two languages are quite similar in the way they're represented, or what we say orthographically similar, such as English and Spanish, you will find some friends between these two languages. So there are words in English and Spanish that when you look at the words, you can kind of guess what the word means in another language. So in the audience here, how many of you speak Spanish? Okay, very well. So I hope you will keep quiet for the next moment and let the other audience try this out. So if you look at these three words here, what is your guess of what these words means? What's the first one? What's your guess of the meaning of the word? Multiple, very good. What's the second word? Celebration, very well. And what's the third one? Poetic, very well. So for words like this that you can see where you know one language but you can guess the meaning in another language, these are called cognate because they're similar in orthographically and they also share similar meanings. Or in a more interesting way, you can call these friends, okay? These are friends. And just like in everyday life, you sometimes have true friends, you sometimes have false friends. Sometimes there are people who you believe they're friends, but they're not really. So these are words that I also want you to guess what they mean. Capetta, what does that mean? Well, because I prompt you, so you know the answer is not carpet. But you would have guessed that it's carpet because orthographically it looks similar to carpet. But in Spanish it means folder. Okay, so you can now see what some of the false friends are. What about idioma? What would be your guess? Idiom? Right, very well, because orthographically it just looks like the word idiom, but it means language. Okay, there are actually many words means language in Spanish. And what about the last word? Embarazada. What does that mean? Huh? Embarrassing, very well. So it may mean embarrassing because it starts with EM and also BR, and so the sound kind of triggers you to think of embarrassing, but the word actually means pregnant. So you can imagine how awkward it would be if you try to guess the meaning of these words based on what it looks like. And so in a bilingual person's mind, what he or she has to do is to tease apart these differences, or you may say commonality between the two languages and also differences between the two languages. Now, given if you have two languages in your mind, you constantly have to navigate these two language systems, you have one hell of a job in front of you. And here's what happens in a bilingual mind. Based on two models called inhibitory control model and adaptive control hypothesis, both written by the same researcher, they hypothesize that being a successful bilingual, well, here what we mean by successful is that you're relatively fluent in both languages and you use both languages fairly often. So you're comfortable using one language or the other. There are forces, what we call exogenous or bottom-up process in the environment that prompts you, that gives you signal of what language to speak. So for example, in this context here, what I have to speak is English and not my mother tongue, which is Cantonese, or not my half-baked Spanish or Brazilian Portuguese or French. And so all this environmental information, the context of the task tells me and prompts me that I have to speak English. And at the same time, I have to suppress these other languages in my mind. And when I make this suppression and make the decision to focus on the language of the task at hand, I'm making a lot of decisions here. And it's called endogenous or top-down process coming from internally, and it's related to how well I control these languages, and it also related to my attention. Okay? Now that's the cognitive side of being a bilingual, that you're constantly flipping back and forth between different languages and you have to make decisions all the time. Now what about the language side? So have you ever wondered if you speak two languages, do you have two sets of concepts or one set of concepts? What's your guess? One set of concepts, right? Because if something like a computer, then you have a concept of a computer, and that concept's supposed to be language general, but it can be represented by two linguistic labels. So if one in a first language, one in a second language. Now, interestingly, there are researchers who are interested in if you speak two languages and what is the nature or characteristics of a translation between the two languages. So that's a lot of the earlier bilingual research focused on this question. And a very interesting feature finding is that if you translate from your first and more dominant language or more fluent language to a second language, which is a little bit weaker and still developing, usually it takes you longer to do so because you have fewer words in the second language to choose from. But if you try to translate the way back from a weaker second language to a more dominant first language, it's faster because you have more words in your first language. So it facilitates that process. Now, when you combine the set of concepts that we have coupled with the multiple linguistic label that we can use to map onto these concepts and the translation, we can understand what we call the revised hierarchical model, which is a model, a psycholinguistic model, described the bilingual mind back in the 1980s. So we start from one set of concepts, and this set of concepts have different strength of connection with the first language and the second language. The relationship between the concept and the first language is stronger than that between the concept and the second language. And at the same time, there's also translation asymmetry, whereby you are faster when you are translating into a stronger language versus when you're translating into a weaker language. Now, it is at this level that we realize that we're constantly juggling between the two language system, and this relationship is contingent on how fluent we are in the two languages. Okay? So in a nutshell, if you have to walk away tonight with one image, remember this imbalance scale. In a bilingual mind, it's like you're constantly juggling between two sides depending on the task at hand and the decision making internally. Okay? Yes? So the question is, there was not a feeling of inhibiting or suppressing the first language. In a context where you know continually you have to speak one language rather than the other, that may sustain that type of decision making. Now, in a slightly different context, I'll share with you what I did during my sabbatical this semester. I just went to 3 places. First, I went to Ecuador in September. Then I went to Saudi Arabia. And then last week, was it last week? I don't even remember. I was in Luxembourg. Okay? Now, when I was in Ecuador, it was fine. My Spanish was very weak, so sometimes I don't really pay attention to what goes on around me because the language doesn't quite get to me because I don't have a lot of awareness to that language. When I was in Saudi Arabia, I don't speak Arabic, and it's very apparent that whatever Arabic goes on around me, I get no meaning from it, except for al-salam, which means peace. But when I was in Luxembourg, things happened because in Luxembourg, there are constantly multiple languages happening in your face. Most of the time when I was in a city, people speak French. But when I get to the university area, it's in the south of Luxembourg, very close to France, and many people speak Luxembourgish. So there are also people who speak German, because Germany is right beside Luxembourg. So in that context, I started to pay attention to all these different languages because they're constantly in my area, and when the French kicks in, it triggers some of my knowledge in French, and that helps me to understand what goes on in the environment. So at that point, I feel like I have to suppress my English because when I'm ordering food at the restaurant, it's French dominant. but my English is much stronger than my French. So I feel the need to, okay, ignore what I know about English and focus on using my French language. So that's the kind of process that it may not be conscious, but it depends on the sociolinguistic context that you may or may not experience it. But now that I give you this idea, you may start to monitor your thoughts when you're in different situations. So as a bilingual, what you have to do is like going on a seesaw board, that you have to place your attention on the language that you're currently using rather than the other languages that you have in your mind. So using this type of research, what we've found in children, adults, and older adults is that there's joint activation of the two languages. It is actually extremely hard to shut down a language, just like you can't shut off your ears. And the constant need to ignore the distracting languages and focus your attention on the language at hand, exercise your mind a little bit, and may give rise to a better or more fluent, more efficient cognitive flexibility. And in some research you may have read that children, adults, or older adults who have lifelong bilingual experiences may have a faster response time or respond accurately in tasks that we call executive functions. So these are tasks that whereby we have to exercise our goal-directed attention, we have a goal to achieve, and then we have to make a decision very quickly. But when the tasks require you to retrieve lexical information or language information, you may be slower because you also have to ignore all these other interference from different languages. So there are the bipolar behavioral consequences of speaking two languages here. Now, remember I told you I also started to look into the control center of the human behavior. In one study, I was interested in looking at if we looked at a group of older adults around the age of 70, and these group of older adults have lifelong experiences of using two languages, roughly about 50 years on a daily basis, versus those who don't, and we try to control them in a lot of ways. So years of education, their proficiency in the language of testing, which is English, would we see bring differences? So this is one of the studies that I have done and showed that for the bilingual older adults who have been using two languages on a daily basis for 50 years, they showed a more sustained white matter tracts, and these differences are all in the front part of the brain. And we don't see any difference in the back part of the brain where they process sounds or visual images. So it's all in the front part of the brain called corpus callosum, where it connects the two hemispheres and also is related to executive functions. Very similarly, we also see the stronger brain networks that we observed in older adults who speak two languages on a daily basis. Now you may wonder, what about children? What about developing children? Now that question is a lot harder to examine because it's more challenging to do neuroimaging research in children, and also because these children are developing their bilingual history. So if anything, the intensity would not be as much as what we have observed in older adults, but we're starting to look at that problem. So now I tell you speaking two languages actually makes a difference in your mind, and it changes the way you process information in the environment. Now I want to talk a little bit about how do we define bilingualism, which is not an easy task. Let's do an experiment. I like to ask this question wherever I go, and I always get very interesting response. Even though we have a smaller audience today, but I do want you to participate in this. So here's a question. Are you a bilingual, or were you able to speak two languages? And you have three choices to answer: yes, no, or I don't know, I'm not sure. Okay? How many of you would say, yes, I'm a bilingual? So I would put up. Okay, this is already a biased sample. Granted, my talk title has bilingualism, so of people who are bilingual who would be more interested in coming. How many of you say, no, I'm not? Okay, we still have a fair amount. How many of you say, I don't know? Okay. Daryl, why do you say you don't know? So what Daryl mentioned is that she speaks another language. English is her dominant language now, but she doesn't speak the other languages very much, although she learned it when she was very young. Now this is kind of story that you would expect from many people in a 21st century. And so this story, I always pick on those people who said, I don't know, because they exactly answer the question, what makes you bilingual? We don't know a lot about children yet. Usage, of course, would be a very critical measurement, but in adults, where you have time to build up that history, we know that the factor of how early it's a critical factor. So the onset age of second language learning, which you may have heard of, or the onset age of active bilingualism. So I made a difference there because I care about bilingualism as a life experience. So I do want to know, when do people actually start using two languages actively on a daily basis? Not when they start learning another language, because being fluent in another language doesn't happen overnight. You won't go to sleep and then the next day you wake up knowing another language. I wish I could do that. So the how early factor is important in adults. Now in children, you may wonder, like, that doesn't quite make sense because children are still building that history. So this factor doesn't quite show as robust as the other factors. And of course, how well do you speak the language? Using Daryl's example, she doesn't feel like she can produce Mandarin very well, so that's why she doesn't feel comfortable saying that she's a bilingual. Now, you may think that it's crucial that we looked at second language proficiency. But at the same time, first language proficiency also change when you learn another language. So we have to look at proficiency in both languages when we consider bilingualism. Now the third factor is how often. Using Daryl's example again, she says she doesn't use it anymore, so it's not an often. So out of these three criteria, she may have learned another language early, but she doesn't use it very often, and also she feels like she's not speaking the other language well. So in a way that she's correct, that she doesn't know, and it's very hard to determine. But many of you said, yes, I'm a bilingual, so I assume you are very fluent in speaking the two languages and you feel comfortable having a conversation in either language that you are using. So out of these three factors, for young children, we know that the how often factor is a very important factor to measure how bilingual a child is. Now, let's look back into research. Sometimes it's very categorical because we like to make things clean so we can make a conclusion. And so for researchers who are interested in the history or how people, when do things start, they may use types of labels that you see in this bubble here. Okay, such as sequential, simultaneous bilingual, lifelong bilingual, emergent bilingual, early or late bilingual, and recently we've also seen labels such as crib bilinguals. Okay, that means these are babies who are exposed to two languages since infancy. So multiple languages are present in the family. For researchers who are interested in the functional usage of bilingualism, they use a different sets of labels, such as additive or subtractive bilingual. You may have heard of these terms. Balanced, unbalanced bilingual, and language minority. Okay? For researchers who care about language proficiency, they use these labels such as fluent, non-fluent bilinguals, dominant bilinguals, English language learners, or heritage bilinguals. And for researchers who cares about how individuals get to the point where they're using the two languages, such as the learning process, they looked at foreign language learners, immersion bilingual, or dual language learners. So those are all different labels. But the trick in deciphering all these labels is that in reality, a lot of these labels are not mutually exclusive. They're overlapping with each other. So to understand research in bilingualism has this important layer is how do we quantify and qualify bilingualism in the research that we consume. And so in a nutshell, even though the elegant design of groups, putting people into bilinguals and monolinguals makes a lot of sense in research, The reality is that bilingualism is a spectrum, is a gradient. And in order to understand research, we have to go beyond the black and the white and to consider the grayscale in such a way that when we see one study and we look at the group characteristics and it says it may be closer on the grayscale versus another study that has the ability to look at the further away scales. Now, this usually is done at the individual level, not necessarily at the global society level, because the sociolinguistic context of bilingualism around the world is extremely complex. There is not necessarily a fixed model of bilingualism around the world. Like the 3 places that I've been to, they all have different characteristics of using multiple languages. They have different needs and they have different historical and political reasons for why they're doing so. So to understand globally research and to understand bilingual research globally, what we need to understand is not only at how much language the individual use on a daily basis, but also their immediate area and also their global context in the community. Then why is bilingualism relevant to education? Now, this is a question that I ask myself a lot, and I'll try to tell you what I have been thinking about. Language and cognition is a very interesting aspect of human development in the way that if you look at this chart here, the vertical axis stands for plasticity, so that means how pliable we are, how much freedom we have in order to grow and expand and connect. And on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, we have the time scale. So beginning from before birth to infancy, which is represented in month, to childhood and to adulthood in years. Now, if you look at the 2 aspects of language and cognition, such as language represented in the blue line and higher cognitive functions such as executive functions in the red line, interesting thing is the plasticity of language peaks at around a year old. So that's when a child learns a lot of different vocabulary and started babbling and started experiment with different sounds and also make up different words. And if you look at executive functions, the peak is around the school age and the preschool age up to elementary school age. But if you look at the overlapping area of these 2 curves, the span of the plasticity peaks during the school age year between language and cognition. So if you grow up with a diverse language experience, such as if you speak a language in your homes, but you learn another language at school, that changes the trajectory of language and cognition in your development. Now, that is a very important key factor in how we see the diversity in classrooms. Let alone that we have people who go to school in speaking a language, but also learn another language. So there are different contexts of bilingualism happening in the classrooms here. So what we have to think about is not only to advance the scientific discourse of understanding how language and cognition interact through the lens of bilingualism, but also how to build bridges between research and practice. Okay? Now, the first bridges that we could build is to think about how we measure bilingualism, both in the research sense and also in the education sense. So I've already told you that researchers like black and white and that we like to put things into bilingual and monolingual, but then we also have to acknowledge the grayscale. And the second potential bridge that we could build is to link what we know about the language and cognitive development of bilingualism to academic skills, which we have done a little bit, but not quite enough. And the third is the longitudinal aspect. So the value of following children over time to see how they change and develop instead of taking a snapshot at different time points. So I will explain to you a little bit further here. So in the first potential bridge, such as looking at the black and white and focusing on the grayscale, that's the research focus. But in education, we have a different set of focus. Any educators here in the audience? Okay, so what would be your guess? What do educators focus on when we think about bilingualism? there are distinct education labels. Distinct education labels relevant to this experience?
Literacy? Literacy?
Yes, very close. So we looked at students as to whether they're English proficients versus those who are not. So we do have similar interests in this, but the two aspects, so whether you use two languages on a daily basis or not, or whether you have your English proficiency level reaching to a certain benchmark, may not be completely overlapping with each other. So one of the potential bridges is to think about how we measure bilingualism in the education context. So for example, in Massachusetts, you fill out, every child going to schools will have to fill out a home language survey. And on this survey, you tell the school about what language you use at home. And sometimes this survey prompts you to give an answer. So pick a language that you use the most or the child first use in the family. And other times, it's a research area. What we do is we looked at a gradient level. We look at how much language you use, and we also looked at how well does a parent judge how well a child speaks a language. And one thing we could do is to think about combining these two ways of measuring bilingualism to give more information for the school district to use to guide their educational decision. So that's one thing that we've been doing now in two school districts. And the second thing is looking at relevance. Now, even in research, we typically look at language by itself, or we look at cognition by itself, and we rarely combine the two together. But what's more interesting is to relate these cognitive and language skills to academic performance. So we know the strength and the weakness of all learners, not only children who have a developing English proficiency. And finally, one area of research that is very lacking, but we have a lot of potential to build bridges, is the continuity. And as I mentioned, bilingualism doesn't happen overnight. So what we have to do is to observe children over the course of time, especially for those children who come from a diverse language background at home, and how they develop in different educational experience with exposure to different languages. So we can see this as in two ways, as in children who come from a non-English speaking families but attending English speaking schools, how do they develop? So these are one way of looking at bilingualism. And the other way to look at this is observe children who come from dominant English speaking background but attend bilingual education classrooms. So there are also another way to look at these issues in combining what happens at home to what happens in school. Okay? So becoming bilingual is a challenging task. And if we looked at what we can do to help the children in the next generation to become more global citizens, we have to look at what happens in the family, what happens in school, and also what happens in the community. And the access and opportunity is what the school could provide to all children to have an opportunity to expose to different languages and also different cultures. So going back to the tower that I told you about, the Tower of Babel, the point of building the tower now is not to reach up to the sky, but rather to go around the globe so we adapt to the global world, and also to think about what do we mean by recognizing language diversity in the community. I think we do quite well in that, to recognizing diversity, but we're not doing good enough in embracing diversity. So that is to say, how do we embrace diversity of each child bringing to the classroom, regardless of whether it's weakness, and how do we harness their strength to help with their weaknesses and challenges in learning. And with that, I will end this talk. Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. So everybody got that question. It's actually a very common question. So you have two parents, and each parent speak a different language, plus other family members may speak a third language. So the question here is, should I, as a grandparent, speak the third language? Would I confuse the child? So one thing we know is that young children are actually extremely sensitive to these social roles of languages. So they know very clearly which person can understand which language. So with a 16-month-old, it is very hard to say, because sometimes even if you speak the dominant language to a 16-month-old, he or she may choose not to respond to you. So with the two languages in the family, German and English, and if you come in but you wonder whether you should speak Spanish to her, I think my recommendation is to speak both. You have some English and then you have some Spanish, so she can still relate to you in a language that she understands, but it's not going to hurt her to speak another language. So human learning potential is actually quite remarkable. We have the capacity to learn multiple languages, and where I just came back from in Luxembourg, very interestingly, children, regardless of your language background, may start off schools learning Luxembourgish, and then they have French added on in the next year, and then they add German in the following year. So it is actually quite remarkable to see these young children harnessing the different languages as resources. But that also speaks to the community, because those three languages are constantly present in their environment. And that may have a more efficient role in ingraining in their mind. But in your case, if you only speak to her on a weekly basis, then you may want to speak both languages. But another easier solution is, why don't you just talk to her more on a daily basis? That's a really great question. So how far can we push the proficiency factor in helping us to determine who's bilingual and who's not? So I think what I would say in that regard is we rarely see bilinguals who are comparable in their two languages. So it's very hard to find a bilingual who have the same level of proficiency to the degree that is similar to native speakers. There is always a discrepancy. So right, a monolingual and a bilingual, a pure monolingual and a pure bilingual actually don't quite exist in the world. What happens is a lot of us are in the spectrum. And in terms of proficiency, it depends on the training or the immersion experience of using a second language. So for example, English is also my more dominant language. So my English usage in an academic way, it's much more advanced than my native language in Cantonese. There's no way I can give this talk in Cantonese, I can tell you that. And the syntax that I speak in Cantonese is also quite contaminated. I realize that a lot of the times when I speak my mother tongue, so to speak, it has a lot of the English influenced in it. And so I can still call myself a bilingual because I speak both languages on a daily basis. So it is imperative that we make an operational definition when we looked at, when you start a study, how do you define bilingualism? So using proficiency is a great way, and you also pointed out that vocabulary is only one aspect of language proficiency, because there's a bigger spectrum of looking at syntax and looking at word choices and looking at pragmatics. So these are all research areas that has been rarely tapped into, that we need to pay attention to when we use the big term proficiency or competency. That is a very challenging question. So how language can be taught differently in schools? I'm not comfortable saying that this is a recommendation, because my classroom teaching experience is limited to higher education, and teaching K-12 is very different. But one thing as a parent that I could share is that I found that using languages interactively is very important, especially on topics that you can allow the child to build narratives based on what they are interested in, and using vocabulary that you try to teach a child to acquire. So for younger children, using a more playful manner to learn languages is much more powerful than using a traditional classroom approach of remembering what this word means and remember the meaning and try to recite it. So for younger children, I think that's a very effective way. And the other thing I've observed very interestingly, I do a lot of observations because I like to watch people. When you look at how young children learn languages, which is usually in this very interactive, naturalistic, and sometimes fairly chaotic manner, because they also learn languages from their peers, versus how adults learn another language, which is often through books, through reading and writing rather than listening and speaking. And these two approaches are very different. So is there some way that we can learn from each other? So is there any way that we can bring some of the children's naturalistic way of learning to adult second language learners, and also bring some of the structure in adult second language learning back to children? That would be some area of research that is of interest, but for the time being, I don't think I have seen anything that looks at the developmental span of the naturalistic differences that we see in the environment, and how does that plays out in the education context. Yes, thank you.
If a child born with cataracts who doesn't have the cataracts removed until 4 or 5 months of age shows a dramatic recovery in how well they see, but they will always show subtle deficits in processing faces because they didn't see faces in those first few months of life. A child who's born with a hearing impairment who does not have that corrected by, say, a cochlear implant in the first few years of life will always have a residual hearing impairment. So the point then is neglect has a devastating effect on brain development.